There's this restaurant in Missouri called Lambert's, and their slogan is home of the throwed rolls. And so basically they come around with like a tray of freshly baked rolls like this. And they like look around, and if you want one, you raise your hand, and the guy literally... Hi, I'm Erin McDowell, and welcome to this episode of Bake It Up a Notch, where we are talking all things rolls. Dinner rolls, sandwich rolls, any kind of roll you can dream up, we're gonna be talking about it today. We're gonna be diving in deep and talking about all the equipment you're gonna need, all the tips, tricks, and techniques you need to get the most perfectly mixed and perfectly shaped rolls. We're gonna be talking about different ways to finish them and make them look like $1 million. It's all coming up in this episode. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in, be sure to like and subscribe so you can be made aware of episodes as they become available. If you could just smell what this table is like, you'd understand why I am so excited to get this recipe going. So let's get ready to roll. A lot of yeasted breads don't require a lot of equipment, so here's what I'm gonna be using in this episode today. We've got square baking pans, round baking pans, rectangular baking pans, and baking sheets, a bench scraper, a bowl scraper, a silicone spatula, a pastry brush, parchment paper. We've got scaling utensils, either a scale or cup and teaspoon measures, and we've got a mixing bowl or an electric mixer fitted with the dough hook attachment. Before we dive in, I want to talk a little bit about one of the main ingredients in dinner rolls, which is yeast. Most of what you're going to need to know to understand yeast better is going to be in our Understanding Yeast episode of Bake It Up a Notch. Let's talk about yeast, baby! So be sure to check that out. You're going to get a lot more detail of everything you need to know. But here's a little bit of a primer for this episode. First, I want to talk about the difference between enriched doughs and lean doughs. Enriched doughs are doughs that have any kind of enrichment sort of ingredient in them. And these are sugar, milk, eggs, butter, things in this vein. Lean doughs, on the other hand, are doughs that are just made with flour, yeast, salt, and water. They're really, really simple. An example of a lean dough would be baguettes and ciabatta. An example of enriched doughs would be things like challah or brioche. Dinner rolls can be either lean or enriched. If you want a fluffier dinner roll, you're probably gonna be looking for an enriched dough. And if you're looking for a crustier dinner roll, you're probably gonna be looking for a lean dough. So since so many people wanna make dinner rolls as part of a large meal, I wanted to provide this cool little tip. It is possible to kind of alter your recipe to be able to make the rolls ahead of time. Here's how you do it. Instead of using warm liquid in your recipe, water, milk, whatever the liquid is, use room temperature liquid. Then let your dough rise at room temperature for the amount of time that the recipe states, and then you're gonna transfer it to the refrigerator to rise overnight. After letting it rise up to 12 hours, you actually have this added benefit that the dough will be more flavorful. As yeast is allowed to rise slowly in that kind of environment and proof very slowly, it gains both strength and flavor. And this is a really lovely kind of bonus feature of opting to do your rolls this way. After letting it refrigerate overnight, we're gonna wanna bring it to room temperature for at least 30 minutes before starting to shape with it, because a cold dough is gonna behave a little bit differently than dough that's been allowed to rise at room temperature. You know, baking has a reputation for being very by the book, and I always try to encourage people that there are places that you can be flexible, and this is one great example. All of the recipes in this episode will work using this technique that I just mentioned, but with other bread recipes you've been making for a long time, it may take a little bit of tweaking to get this overnight rise just right. Most yeasted doughs are made using the straight dough mixing method or the straight mixing method. This is a really, really simple method where basically all the ingredients are just combined together and then the dough is kneaded until a smooth dough forms. So we're gonna start by doing it right now. I usually start by mixing all the dry ingredients together first. So for this recipe, I'm gonna mix my flour, some sugar, salt, and the yeast together. I'm gonna let that combine for a minute before I start adding the other ingredients. Once you've mixed all of those ingredients, those dry ingredients to combine, we can add any other wet ingredients. In this case, I'm adding a little bit of butter and also my water into the bowl. In some recipes where you're using the straight dough method, recipes are mixed kind of just until the dough forms. And in other recipes, they're mixed much more intensely. It's even sometimes called intense mixing to yield like a really, really super smooth dough, actually like this one. So both work. It's kind of just gonna depend on how long the recipe says to mix it and at what speed. But no matter how or what speed you're going at, all of these that produce a dough like this are the straight dough mixing method. Most doughs that are mixed using the straight dough method can actually also be mixed by hand, just in a large bowl using a wooden spoon or a spatula, and then finished by kneading by hand. If a dough is stickier, you may have to do it all inside the bowl. If it's a little bit firmer, you can usually take it out once it comes together and start kneading it right on your work surface. After mixing and kind of getting your dough into the bowl, it's time to let it have a proof or a rise. During this time, the yeast is consuming carbohydrates that are in the dough, kind of eating them as food, and this is causing them to expel carbon dioxide gases, which then in turn causes the dough to expand or rise. So there are two different stages at which this happens. The first stage of fermentation or rising comes right after mixing. The dough is put into a lightly greased bowl and covered and allowed to rise for the appropriate amount of time. We call this stage bulk fermentation because the full amount of the dough, the bulk of it, is rising. Sometimes bulk fermentation happens at room temperature, sometimes it can happen in the refrigerator for a longer period of time, but that is the initial fermentation stage. The second happens after shaping, kind of before the dough is baked. It is allowed to rise again, helping the texture and kind of forming the final shape and helping with the final amount of rise that we're gonna get. It also helps to promote the ideal kind of crust on the exterior. Sometimes a dough is covered during this stage. If it is covered, it's important that it's very loosely covered. We don't want to cover it so tightly that we restrict its expanding and its growth. For a stickier dough, I might cover it with greased plastic wrap very, very loosely, or maybe just a clean kitchen towel that's gonna go right over the top of it. Other times dough isn't covered. It's left kind of to be exposed to the air to help it form a little bit of a crust on the exterior, almost like a skin. It's gonna make it easier to score the dough and kind of put any of those finishing elements on, especially for crustier or lean doughs. A few words about the phrase double in size. If you have read recipes that are for yeast breads, you have probably read this phrase before. Not every dough that you're going to make is going to double in size. So while this phrase is really commonly used in a lot of recipes, other times it's important to know that it may only just kind of visibly expand or become a little bit puffy. Pay attention to what the actual visual cue of the recipe is. Don't expect that every single dough is going to double in size. But when a recipe does tell you, let rise until nearly double in size or until double in size, one of the things that you can do is put it into a bowl that's about twice the size of the dough itself. That way, when it reaches the top edge of the bowl, you know that it's actually expanded to double in size. Remember, the amount of time it's going to take is going to depend on the temperature of the room. So if a recipe tells you that something's going to take an hour to rise, but your house is really, really chilly, it might take more like an hour and a half to get to that desired point. Pay attention both to time cues and visual cues when you're working with yeast recipes. I mentioned this briefly at the beginning of the episode when we were talking about enriched doughs versus lean doughs, but it's important when you're talking about proofing to remember that enriched doughs are going to take longer to rise than lean doughs. So not only are recipes for them going to include longer rise times, but also if you're noticing that your dough hasn't reached the appropriate visual cue yet, it might just need a little bit more time. Enrichments really weigh these doughs down. It just takes longer for them in some cases to get to that appropriate consistency. Also, when doughs have been refrigerated, remember, it may take a little bit more time for that yeast to become activated again and start doing its job. That's why we like to bring doughs that we have refrigerated back to room temperature unless the recipe directs otherwise. after your dough has had its first rise or its first fermentation, the bulk fermentation, it's time to divide the dough. And then we can go into shaping, which is especially fun with rolls. It's really important to divide the dough evenly because, as my culinary school instructors used to say, if it looks the same, it cooks the same. So we want rolls that are similar in size so that we don't end up kind of with one that's really dark over here and one that's really blonde in the center, that sort of thing. So there's two ways that you can divide the dough. One, of course, is just kind of by eye, being really careful. And I wanted to show the way that I do it by eye. The first thing that I do is I try to get it into a rectangular shape of even thickness. So it's really important that you kind of stretch it. I like to stretch it at the corners to make a more rectangular corner. And then we are just gonna push the dough, make sure it's fairly even in thickness. You don't need to be crazy precise here. But what we're doing is we're trying to make it rectangular so that then we can just divide it in half a bunch of times. So what I'm gonna do is if I'm trying to make 12 pieces, I'll start by cutting it in half. And you can be really precise, you can measure it. Like in this case, I can actually use the inches here on my bench scraper to just kind of like say, okay, this is the right, I'm exactly at half. Or again, you can eyeball it. But first, if I'm dealing with the halves, then if I wanna keep going, I can just cut those halves in half. And at every stage, I can kind of check and see if I need to give one a little more, and then I can cut those halves in half, and so on and so forth until I get my ideal roll size. This helps keep everything even kind of all throughout the process, giving me as close as possible to equal results, even though I'm just doing it by eye. The other tool, or the other way, if you wanna be even more precise, you can call in one of my favorite tools of all time, the scale. We can use the scale to weigh out the dough so that each piece is exactly the same as all of the other portions in the recipe. I like to scale the full amount, weigh the full amount of the recipe, see what that weight is, then divide it by the yield. Then you can use that as the kind of magic number to weigh all of your pieces of rolls, and they're all gonna turn out the same every single time. All right, this is where we're really gonna get to have some fun and make our rolls really beautiful and just get our hands all flowery, all of my favorite things. It's the shaping. We're actually gonna go over a bunch of different ways to shape rolls. I've actually got 9 of my favorites. And the thing is that these all work so great. And some of them are really simple, some are much more complicated, and they all look like $1,000,000. So it's a great way to just bring something a little different to the table. Let's get shaping. First up is just a basic round roll shape. And I think a lot of people do this wrong because they kind of just start with a piece sometimes that's square like this, and they kind of bring the corners up and they just kind of keep smushing it. And that is one way that you can do it. Whenever you're increasing or tightening the surface area on the dough, it is going to naturally give it that kind of rounder shape. So pulling all the corners up and grouping it up is gonna do that, but it's also gonna make kind of a nasty seam, and that can make the roll uneven once it bakes, all kinds of potential problems. So I like to treat it more like it's a tiny loaf of bread. So we're gonna start by kind of folding the dough over onto itself a few times, trying to start making the round shape. So typically to do that, I just sort of fold the edges in onto itself. Then, because this dough is a little sticky, I'm just gonna give it a little bit of flour. Now I'm going to use this part of my hand, kind of the outer heel of my hand, and I'm gonna use that on the surface along with kind of this portion to round the roll, and it's going to increase the surface tension and kind of round it and also make a more intense skin on the outside. So we're pushing it kind of with our thumb towards the outer heel of my hand, and then you're pushing it out to the thumb and out over here, and we're basically using this portion of our hand to round it. And what's really cool about doing this is when you do it right, you often get no seam at all on the bottom of the roll. So this is why we do it. This is that little extra bit of effort, and it's worth it. So now that you know how to make a round roll, you can use multiple rounds of dough to make other effects. Like 2 rounds of dough would be a split top roll, And 3 rounds of dough would be one of my favorites that we do in my family every year, at Thanksgiving, the clover roll. So when you're doing that, you're gonna wanna divide your dough into 3 equal pieces. Again, you can use your scale, or you can use my little eyeballing technique. And then we're just gonna take these individual small pieces and we're going to round them each individually. I guess I'll do these 2 at the same time, why not? And then when we put them in the pan, we put them together. So whether you're baking them on a baking sheet or in a muffin pan, you just are gonna place them together like this. They're gonna rise together, bake together, and they're gonna form that delightful clover shape. One more thing, with these clover rolls or with split top rolls or just classic round rolls, if you opt to bake them in a muffin pan, they're going to have straighter sides and they're gonna bake up a little bit taller. If you bake them on a baking sheet instead, they're gonna spread and proof and everything to be a little bit wider. So it's just a different look, but both work great and produce beautiful rolls. All right, so this next style, I'm gonna start by just gently rounding the dough, but not as much as if I was making it as a round, because we're gonna continue to shape it, so we don't want to increase that surface tension too much. This next one is the style of traditional Parker House roll, which is patted out or rolled out and then folded. Typically it's brushed with butter in the center before being folded in half, and it makes this beautiful sort of pull apart roll after baking. So I rounded it. Now I'm just going to pat that round using a floured hand. I'm gonna pat it to about half the thickness that it was. And I'm using these 3 fingers because I'm trying to keep it oblong in shape. This is one of the things I love about bread baking, is that like you can the shaping methods can kind of be personal to what works for you. But I like to do this and kind of just use those fingers to encourage it and press it into an oblong. And then just remember that you can also come in with your hands and gently stretch it too. Once we get it into this kind of oblong shape, if you wanted to brush it with butter or filling or whatever you wanted to do, you would add it at this point, or we're just ready to fold it in half and we have our little Parker House roll shape. This shape is also used for my favorite steamed buns, the lotus buns. So that's another thing that this is often called, is the lotus leaf shape bun as well. So there's lots of different ways to make knotted rolls. This happens to be one of my favorites. We're gonna start by pressing our dough out with our fingertips into kind of this rectangular shape. Then we're gonna fold the dough onto itself a few times. We're basically making a log. And I'm just gonna keep folding the dough over and then pressing it with my fingertips to seal. Then we'll just start rolling it. I need a little flour there. It was starting to get a little sticky. We'll start rolling our dough into this kind of long strand. And when you're shaping something like this, use flour whenever something's getting sticky, but just don't use any more than you have to, because sometimes it can actually be problematic. We'll talk more about that later. All right, once we have our long strand, we're going to bring the dough together. I'm like, I know how to do it. I just usually need to practice it once first. So sorry, bear with me guys. Because I usually do 1 through, oh yeah, that's how you do it. Okay, we'll start by tying a knot, allowing one piece to go through and come through the hole like this, one end. Then the other end will bring through and put through the center of the hole, and that forms our little knot shape. One more. Why not? Okay. Let's next talk about braiding rolls. Of course, the cool thing about braids is that almost any way you can do for a loaf of bread, you can also do for a roll. You're just working with much smaller pieces, and in some cases, you know, handling them a little differently. I want to start by showing you the way that I shape rolls with just a single strand of dough. I'm going to start by making a strand as we did before, pressing the dough over onto itself a few times, and then rolling it into a nice long piece to work with. Once we've got our nice long strand, we're gonna bring it into this kind of loop. It's a P, it's a B, it's a D, depending what angle. We wanna make sure that where we bring it through, it's underneath the strand that's forming this long tail. So we're just gonna press it so that it's adhered there. Then we're gonna bring that long tail through the loop like this to form kind of this twisted shape. It'll almost start to look like a pretzel for a moment with this long tail hanging out. Then we're gonna grab that loop with our fingers and we're gonna twist it one time. After we twist it, we're just gonna bring this piece up, wrapping it through, allowing the end to go through that final loop, and it just makes it look like a tiny loaf of challah, but it's just a single strand braid. The cool thing about using braiding as a technique is that you can really take any style of braid that you would do on a loaf and do it on a roll too. So I'm gonna do right now a 4-strand round braid that's sometimes used for challah. We'll start by making all of our strands the same size and length. Okay, great. So for this one, it's a nice 4-strand braid. So what we're going to do is we're gonna start by making this kind of like pound sign almost. We're gonna weave one under our top. We've got 2 horizontal strips here, and we're gonna lay 2 vertical, and they're both gonna be partially woven like a lattice. So this one is under the top strand and over the bottom one, and this second piece is going to be over the top strand and under the bottom one. And we've made that little pound sign. And then what we're gonna do is basically this process of just folding the dough over the piece next to it. So what we're going to do is we're gonna fold each strand, the kind of the top one over the one below it. So I just folded it over that one. Now I'm gonna do the same with this one. Fold it over the next guy. This one folded over, folded over. Now, luckily, if you're doing this with a full loaf of bread, you have to do this several more times, but with a roll, we only have one more to do. So we just wanna crisscross these ends, kind of then tucking them under the roll as we do it. So we take these 2 ends that are still visible here, we crisscross them, and we tuck the ends under. We take these 2 ends here, we crisscross them, and we tuck the end under, tuck that end under. And same here, we crisscross, and we tuck our ends under. And you can just kind of help it, round it a little bit, and we have a beautiful braid, just like a 4-strand round challah loaf. In this next section, we're gonna talk about a few different shapes where you actually kind of roll out the dough first. So I'm just gonna roll out this dough on a lightly floured surface to a certain thickness. You know, the thickness that you're gonna roll it to is gonna depend on the actual effect that you're, making with the recipe. The first one we're gonna talk about are crescents. You can actually use the same technique that we used in the yeasted puff pastry episode to shape croissants, to shape really cute little dinner rolls. So I'm just gonna roll out the dough here and get it into kind of a nice rectangle shape of an even thickness. So to cut crescent rolls, we actually want to start by cutting a triangle shape. Just move the rest of our dough for a moment. And then we can just kind of take our triangle shape, stretch it out a little bit, and start to roll it into a little crescent. That's actually quite a big crescent roll. It looks a little bit more like a croissant. But the cool thing about this is then you can make them any size. This size would be really great for more like a sandwich, for building as like a sandwich roll, and a slightly skinnier triangle rolled up the same way would yield more like a classic dinner roll. Okay, so let's talk about another technique you can use, which is sort of inspired by the same shaping technique that you would use if you were making cinnamon rolls. We're just gonna cut the dough into a strip about 1 inch wide, and then we'll just roll the dough up into a spiral like this. And then we can tuck the end under just a smidge, and we have a really cute little roll shape. This is great in a muffin pan. It's also great just baked on its own as a solo roll. Then the last thing I want to talk about are pull-apart rolls. You can use some of the same styles that you would use to make a pull-apart loaf of bread and make some really, really wonderful rolls as well. So one way that I do that is by cutting squares or rectangles of dough, like this. If you were using some kind of filling like I do in my garlic herb pull-apart rolls, what I would do is I would brush that filling right in the center, and then I would fold the dough in half. What's cool about this is you can bake just this style as a roll, or you can stack multiple of these together to create this sort of accordion or fantail roll. Another way you can do it is by cutting a circle or round of dough. So again, with this circle shape, you can apply some of that filling or butter or something to the center and then fold it in half. And you can place that into your muffin pan. You can fold it in half again to form this sort of like fortune cookie shape of roll. And all of these, either stacked together or baked solo, make for this really cool pull-apart effect. You can also flavor it with pretty much any kind of flavored butter or some kind of flavorful basting on the inside that you can think of. Those are just some of the ways that you can shape rolls. There are so many options out there, and it's a really fun way to get creative and really make your rolls look incredible when you bring them to the table. One other thing I wanted to note is that some recipes are gonna call for rolls to be baked on their own on something like a baking sheet, where they are able to brown kind of all evenly on the exterior. Other recipes have you place them into a pan in such a way that as they bake, they grow together. They might kind of literally expand to be touching one another, and they may even support one another as they start to rise. This style of roll is often called a pull-apart roll because they are baked together. So I was talking about the pull-apart shaping method, where you can kind of stack little pieces together so that when you bake the roll, you can literally pull them apart. But this style is also called pull-apart because we're going to have to separate these rolls before we serve them. All right, let's talk about some of the kind of finishing techniques that you can do to just make your rolls extra special and extra beautiful. There's a few different ones. Especially when we're talking about enriched breads, we really want to talk about finishes like egg wash and melted butter. Both of these are going to contribute a little bit to browning, but egg wash is extra special for a few reasons. Egg wash, because of all that protein in there, is also gonna really help anything we wanna put on the top of our rolls. It's really gonna help it to stick and adhere, which is one of the things we love. Whenever I'm brushing something with egg wash, my egg wash is just one large egg with a little bit of water to help loosen it up, beaten really well. And I just wanna make sure that I brush some of that excess egg wash off of the brush and really just brush all over, really trying to get into all the nooks and crannies and give it a nice even coating, but without letting it pool. I don't want like a lot of egg wash sitting in any one spot. So I'm just gonna kind of brush it all over, and you can use different kinds of egg washes, which I actually have that to show you right here. You can use just the egg white, just the egg yolk, or you can use the whole egg. And they all sort of contribute something. Here in this row right here, you can see we just used egg white. And what it did was it made the surface of the rolls shiny, but they're not as brown as the ones next to it. So that's something to note. Then this next row was used with egg yolk only. It browned really nicely, but it does not have the same sheen that the other rolls have. Then these last two rows were used with whole egg wash, meaning the whole egg was beaten with a little bit of water and it got that nice even golden brown color. So those are all reasons that we really, really, really love egg wash. While we're talking about brushing things though, let's talk about butter. I love brushing things with butter. This can be done before baking, halfway through baking, or at the end of baking when things are fresh and just come out of the oven. It does contribute a little bit to browning, but this is more about flavor. So one of my favorite ways to do it is to baste. I call it more basting rather than brushing because we are just gonna use the melted butter when these are pretty fresh from the oven. The pan was still lightly warm, and we're just gonna give it a nice coating of melted butter all over the surface. And if you do that while they're still warm, it's gonna absorb in a really, really lovely way. I mainly want to point out that while butter adds a lot of flavor and it does add that little bit of browning, it's not going to help inclusions stick as well. So if you're wanting to put things like sesame seeds, everything seasoning, kosher salt, things like that on the exterior of your rolls, it's important to go ahead and use some kind of egg wash, whether it's just the egg white, the egg yolk, or the whole egg. So you can see the appeal between the non-buttered, which look like beautiful rolls, but look at these shiny, buttery babes. That's where it's at. All right, now let's talk about some of those finishes that we love to see. I'm gonna start by egg washing all of my rolls that I shaped in our little shaping demos here. We can really add just about anything to the surface of these rolls that we want. Anything from seeds, coarse salt, I love to use flaky salt, spices like cracked pepper, dried herbs, really anything can go kind of on the exterior. Ooh, shredded cheese. I love to do like a little Parmesan on the outside of my roll. While you do not have to brush with egg wash for these inclusions to stick, it's definitely really helpful, especially when your shape has nooks and crannies and curves and things like these various braids and twists do. It'll really just help those inclusions, those garnishes to stay right where we want them. So one of the last things that you can do to really make your baked good look amazing is some intricate scoring patterns. But guess what? Scoring also doesn't have to be intricate. I think a lot of people hear scoring and they think it's gonna be really scary. Scoring can be as simple as, cutting a snip into a roll like this with scissors, or it can be as elaborate as using an actual scoring tool, which is referred to as a lame, to cut kind of these delicate patterns. So when you're scoring, you basically want to use the sharpest utensil that you possibly can, and don't be afraid to cut fairly deep. The purpose of a score mark is to give the steam in a recipe kind of a place to escape and kind of encourage the roll to stay in the shape that you want it. By applying these score marks, we just kind of help to keep the shape even. It's almost like we're telling the dough what to do, exactly where we want it to happen. Here's a little idea sparker if you already have some yeast dough recipes in your baking repertoire that you love. Most doughs that you bake as full loaves with a few adjustments can be baked as rolls. Of course, this works in lots of different ways just in terms of miniaturization. Like you can just make a smaller baguette that makes for a great sandwich roll by making mini baguettes. But it also works by taking things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as becoming rolls, like soft pretzels, which then make, of course, wonderful rolls. Or you can just do it with a favorite loaf and even translate the shaping method, like taking a loaf of challah and turning it into challah rolls. Challah. The good news about mistakes with rolls is that if you eat the roll warm, you may not even notice it, because warm rolls are the most delicious thing, and so many of these things we're about to talk about are really minute details. But because rolls are really easy to master, I think it's worth talking about them to make sure that we can all make our prettiest, most perfect rolls. First things first. When you're shaping something, the whole process of shaping can sometimes make these seam marks, like when we were making strands for our braided rolls and things like that. Sometimes there can be a seam. It's important to try to keep that seam so that it's on the bottom of the roll, not only for the physical appearance, but if it's on the top, it's more likely during proofing and baking to kind of split open, which can alter the shape of the roll. I have one right here where you can kind of see a visible seam in this like marking on the surface of one of the strands. The other reason I know it's a visible seam is because it unfurled the strand. Basically during proofing, it caused this to not stay attached well, and we ended up with a pretty uneven shape. So that's one of the things that keeping those seams tucked underneath where they're not gonna bother us, one of the pros of doing that. The next thing is shaping evenly. I talked about earlier, if you don't end up with all your rolls the same size, you could kind of end up with uneven baking. And this tray is such a great example of it. We have all these nice even shapes of rolls, and then we just have one tiny guy up in the corner. He's a little bit too dark. Someone's gonna be upset that they get that roll because the other ones are bigger. So we just like to try to keep everything uniform in size as best we can to avoid family arguments as much as improper baking. Another thing that you can do is shape a roll too tightly. When you shape a roll too tightly and you create so much surface tension on the outside of the roll, it can actually cause the roll to sort of burst, it almost builds up too much inside. It has nowhere to kind of proof or rise evenly. And one of the things that can happen is it can kind of split towards the base, or sometimes it will happen towards the top. It can kind of just create this like burst out thing. You think you've shaped the most beautiful, perfect round rolls, and then after baking, they've got this kind of split that you weren't expecting. One of the mistakes can happen during the shaping phase. A lot of times in baking recipes, you'll hear that people use phrases like on a lightly floured surface. One of the reasons for this is because a lot of recipe developers don't want you to incorporate too much flour into the recipe. When it comes to bread shaping, it's not always about incorporating flour into the recipe. It's a little bit more about making the shaping specifically more difficult. And this is a mistake that I see so many home bakers make because they feel like the dough is sticking to the surface, sticking to their hands, so they'll use a lot of flour, but a lot of flour can actually be creating more problems for you. Here's one example. I was trying to bring this heavily floured piece of dough together to like form that seam to start around. And even when I squeeze it really actively together, it's starting to peel apart. And that's because there's big pieces of flour in there. Similarly, if I try to roll this, that exact thing that I was doing before of using, it's literally just sliding across the surface because nothing is sticking. But if I take that same piece of dough, brush away some of the excess flour, and have a work surface for it, that exact same piece of dough, see, now it's sticking almost too much to the surface. So the point just being, you need to use the amount of flour you need to use. If you need to use a little bit, but then tap off the excess so that you can get just the amount that you need to form a nice shape. Similarly, over here, with making a strand, I've got this piece of dough, and if I try to roll this out, my hands kind of just, see how it's I use the word floppy. It almost is just flopping under my hands instead of following the guidance. Rather than elongating, it's just moving back and forth because there's too much flour. One of the first things I can do when that happens is brush all the excess flour off of the surface and of the dough. You can even kind of try to press it, bring some of that flour, incorporating it a little bit, and then you'll be able to roll it out again and start getting it into the shape that you want it. So just remember, use what the flour you need, but too much flour can actually create a whole host of problems if you're not careful. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Bake It Up a Notch, where we talked all things dinner rolls and just rolls in general. We talked about, as usual, all the equipment you were gonna need. We showed you where things could go wrong. We talked about tons of ways to make them beautiful and shape them, and ways to finish them to get the most out of the recipes. As always, all of these delicious recipes are linked in the video description below, and you can find them on food52.com. Be sure to like and subscribe so you can be made aware of every episode as they become available every month. And be sure to tag me if this episode inspires you to bake. I want to see your rolls. Tag me or Food52 on Instagram and use hashtag #BakeItUpANotch. As always, I'm wishing you lots and lots of happy baking, and we will see you next time.